to raise a couple of issues here, not to point fingers on the regulators, but because Congress is on the brink of passing legislation that will fundamentally change our financial sector, and it's not just members on this side of the aisle that are saying this. Over the weekend, I listened to one of our Democratic colleagues say that the Dodd bill would lead to permanent bailout authority and a fundamental change of our system. So there is that concern, and the underlying premise of the bill is the belief that despite the regulators' performance in recent years, regulators are going to always know here what to do to mitigate the next systemic shock, are going to know that. And the case of Lehman Brothers, I think, proves that this is a shaky precedent upon which we are basing the future health of our capital markets. Because there's another way to look at this. And I remember an argument Mr. Geithner made that I thought was a profound one. You said the top three things to get done are capital, capital, capital. It's the fact that we allowed these institutions to over-leverage, right? The regulators allowed them to over-leverage. I agree with that. I remember Greenspan said the reason the capital issue is so often raised is that, in a sense, it solves every problem. And I remember Volcker saying the same thing, or essentially that once. So that is where the reform efforts should be centered. Now, the wider presence of the Dodd bill, which is, frankly, a lot of economists are raising issue with this concept of a permanent bailout authority. But let's go over the regulatory experience here. There's an expectation of regulatory competence in the market. Counterparties, creditors, investors, they expect the federal regulators to have a firm understanding of the solvency of an institution, and whether or not that institution is basically accurately portraying their liquidity position. Are those leverage ratios really what they're supposed to be? So we're looking at the examiner's report here, and it says the SEC deferred to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. We mentioned these stress tests. You did 3 stress tests. You were chairman at the time, Mr. Geithner, of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. You were president of the bank. And Lehman failed all 3. And in the words of the bankruptcy examiner, it does not appear that any agency required any action of Lehman in response to the results of the stress testing. And the New York Fed presumably had the authority under the Memorandum of Understanding with the SEC to require Lehman to take corrective action. Maybe you feel otherwise. But the bottom line seems to be that the Fed could have tightened terms and raised haircuts on collateral. Failure to use that leverage likely lulled the management of Lehman into believing that the government would save the day. And that's the moral hazard problem I have with all of this. I want to see more market discipline in this equation. But let me let you respond. But I think it signaled to market participants that a firm that the Fed privately knew to be failing should be treated as just another counterparty. That's my concern. Could I have your observations on that? And let's get back to the capital statement you made earlier.
Congressman, I really agree where you started. We cannot design a system that relies on the wisdom of regulators to act preemptively with perfect foresight, come in and preemptively diffuse pockets of risk and leverage in the system. That may be possible. We'll do our best to do that, but you can't build a system that requires that level of preemptive exercise of perfect foresight. It is not possible. The only way I'm aware of to design a more stable system is to use capital requirements, as you said, to set and enforce constraints and leverage on institutions that could pose catastrophic risks to the financial system. That is the centerpiece of the reforms this committee embraced. And to be able to do that on a consolidated basis for institutions that pose systemic risk is the essential, necessary reform that we all have to support. Now, it's not sufficient, but it's necessary. You also, again, to make credible the possibility of allowing failures in the future, you have to make sure the system can manage those failures without collateral damage to the innocent. And again, that's what the bill does. Now,
yep, I understand that. But under the Dodd bill, the creditors of any company that is resolved under the Dodd bill will have a chance to be bailed out. You know, If the
No, that is
creditors
not the
are
way-
not to take most of the losses as they did in Lehman, a fund isn't necessary.
Gentleman's time has expired.
It's counterintuitive.